Coward's Footfalls. A Pale Ring short story. Written and narrated by Brian McKee. Taius! What are you doing? Help me! Taius Joran chanced a glance over his shoulder and was forever a changed man for the act. Glenn Melfield, his best friend of over 20 years, lay squirming in the half-mud, half-cobble path that was the only official entrance to the small village of Puckton. His weather-leathered face, smeared with muck and reddened with a potent cocktail of rage and fear, sent Taius's gut squirming with guilt. Two men clad in the padded armors of a village militia pinned him to the earth, forcing his feebly struggling hands behind his back to clasp him in irons. "Help me!" Glenn repeated, his fury replaced now with frantic, desperate terror. "They're hurting me! Taius, please!" "Shut it, thief!" One of the guards spat, driving a merciless fist into the back of Glenn's head, forcing his already dirtied face into the mud, where its condition surely only worsened. That was the last thing Taius saw of Glenn that day. Choking back a sob, he ran as quickly as his legs could take him into the wall of willows that surrounded Puckton, trading the firelight of the village's torches and lanterns for the darkness of the night. Tears and greasy black hair clouded the vision of his bloodshot brown eyes, and his teeth, concealed behind cracked white lips, clenched so tight together he feared they would crack. "It was supposed to be easy!" he screamed in his mind, quickly hooking a left off the trail and into the marshy wilds around the village. "Five's sake, did they have to draw their swords? Did they have to beat him?" He heard them, heavy footfalls behind him and drawing closer. A fresh surge of panic pumped his legs for him, sending him forward with speeds his ill-fed form was not ready to maintain. The chase went on for several minutes, and with each one, the forest crowded him more and more. Colorful toadstools became more and more colorful, and the terrain became increasingly twisted with moss-smothered roots and berry-spangled shrubs. Finally, after what felt like forever, his threadbare boot caught a stray root and sent him spiraling head over heels into a shallow, waterlogged ditch on the swampy floor. He opened his mouth to release a yelp, only to receive a foul-tasting liquid that surely couldn't be water. Gurgling, spluttering, and struggling to contain his coughs, he pulled his face free from the muck and pressed his back against the wall of the ditch. There he sat, gasping for air, waiting for his chasers to pass him by. More heavy boots came, and soon stopped at the top of the ditch. Taius clamped a hand over his mouth to conceal his breaths, though his panic-addled mind feared the guards would find him just by the ripples created in the water by his uncontrollable shivers. "Blast! Where did that coward go?" one of them grumbled, kicking a stray stone into the scummy pool. "What's he thinking, running off into the swamps like this? Has he got a death wish? Bah, who cares? We'll never find him in this darkness. Let the beasties have him," the other said, his voice far deeper and reminding Taius of a hacksaw taken liberally to bone. "We caught his friend. Let's see that problem dealt with." Taius blinked, focusing on the words of their discussion even as they turned to walk back to Puckton. "You don't plan to kill him, do you, sir?" "Me? Nah. But it ain't up to me. The scrawny little pukes did break into the mayor's house, though. And you know how much he doesn't like thieves. If the kid's lucky, he might get to keep his life. Big if, though. He's for sure losing his hands, at least. But come on, my feet are pruning." Taius waited for them to leave, his ears straining to pick out the wet clumps of their heavy boots as they wandered back to town. Only once he was certain they had been gone for several minutes did he permit himself to breathe. After sucking in a painful lungful of air, he released it in a long, horrified whimper. The mental image of Glenn with a bloodied stump in the place of his hands, where his face, likewise painted red, flashed through his mind. Taius was not an impressive man, nor one of good constitution. The mental image and the general terror of his situation drove him to retch. If he had eaten anything in the last few days, he might have added something to the ditch's water supply that was only half as rancid as its usual contents. Instead, all Taius could offer was a series of dry heaves and pitiful burbles of despair. He had known it was a bad idea. He had told Glenn, he had told him it was a really, really bad idea to try and steal from the mayor of a frontier town. Laws and concepts of decency were rarely noted and usually ignored this far away from the Emyran core, especially in a blasted swamp filled with all sorts of nasty creatures that would like nothing more than to make a meal of anyone in the area. Black-scale kobolds, muckleers, miscuits, and who knew what else. But Glenn had insisted. "Don't worry, Taius," he had said. "Sweet as a butterfly and charming as a poodle. Just follow my lead. Keep your head down and your eyes open. We'll be in and out, grab a fistful of valuables, take them back to Mosswind Perch, and be set for life. No more sleeping in holes?" Taius had asked hopefully. "No more sleeping in natural holes. Now, man-made holes of ill repute, on the other hand..." The two had laughed. They had laughed, shared a drink, cuddled up for warmth as the sun set, leaving only the glow of the pale ring to illuminate them through the thick fog of the Mossmire. Well, they had gotten in easy enough. Under cover of the dark silence of night, they had slipped inside an old window and started rummaging through the rooms. Now, if only someone had thought to warn them that the mayor had a Lasuni warhound for a pet. Taius shuddered recalling it. More muscle than mutt, and with a proclivity for violence that made it more of a monster than anything else. Even if they were intruders, that thing had no business being so blasted horrific. It had almost taken Glenn's foot off with that bite. And in the end, that was the main reason Glenn had fallen behind. His good foot could still kick, and that had gotten the dog off of him. But it couldn't keep him at a sprinting pace all on its own. And so it was that Glenn fell behind and got caught. And Taius ran. He ran. Of course he ran. That was what he did. That was what he always did. He ran from his drunken father and the ghost of his dead mother. He ran from the loan sharks who got tired of his excuses. He ran from that one Crovan lass who decided he was the solution to her yearning. And then he had run into Glenn, the one person he didn't want to run away from. A fellow loser, like Taius, but one with ambition and courage and bravery and a damn good jawline to boot. He had promised them a way out. That was what they'd been working towards. And now Glenn was gone. And Taius ran. "Oh, gods," Taius breathed, unable to decide if he should hold his hand to his mouth to stifle his sobs or not. His insides twisted, and the look Glenn had given him as he ran filled his mind 1,000 times over. He squirmed, choked, and felt like dying, but was too afraid to do that either. Slowly standing up, dripping with swamp water. He looked up at the sky. His heart fell as far beneath the horizon as the sun. It was not a clear night, but he could still catch thin slivers of ring light punching through the cloud canopy. Stars sparkled beyond the gaps in the gray, a sea of diamonds against an obsidian veil, too far to reach, but always taunting him with the concept of peace. More importantly, he had no idea where the hell he was. Oh, shit. Taius amended his earlier sentiment, looking around for a moment. Hoisting himself back up onto the ledge of the ditch, he hunted for the tracks of the men who had chased him, figuring he could follow them back to the road, and then think of what to do from there. But the wetlands were not keen on showing him their secrets. Mud water had already filled the depressions of their footprints, and in this darkness he'd never be able to distinguish it from the floor of the forest. Shivering and sniffling, Taius spent a while feeling fruitlessly in the dark for somewhere to rest. He'd have to wait until the sun came up, he decided. Then he could decide where he would run away to next. Of course, if anything in this life were that easy, he wouldn't be in this situation. As it so happened, it never was that easy, and the Mossmire was not a place that took mercy on the foolish. After some more minutes of walking, Taius had another spot of bad luck. A rancid stink, like rotting corpses, hit him like a sledgehammer tearing down a house. Cursing, one hand flew up to his nose to try and cover it. A bout of nausea came over him, a rippling wave that sent his senses spinning and his feet scrambling. One of them came down on a hard stone barely lodged into a slope of slippery mud. It lurched under him with a squelch, and Taius barely had time to belt out a comically high-pitched "fuck" before the ground started moving, taking him with it. Birds and bats snapping in the trees squawked their alarm as the wet avalanche roared in the night, and Taius's squealing voice rose an octave when it fell over a previously unseen ledge, and he entered freefall. He only fell for a second or two, though, before hitting something soft, wet, and rank. Splashing in the dark dampness for a few seconds, he managed to right himself, his head breaking the surface of what he hoped was another puddle of swamp water. He was still scared, of course, but for a moment, a swelling fire of frustration made itself known to him. He stood, roaring his anger and driving his fist into the wet wall he had just fallen over, as if he could transfer his misery. All he received for his efforts were some bloody knuckles. At this rate, the guards in town wouldn't need to punish him for his crime. He was getting his just desserts just being out here. Taking a minute to catch his breath, Taius leaned heavily against the wall. He punched and looked around. The clouds were clearing, at least a little, and no trees were obscuring his view of this little pit. The ring light revealed that the ground here was salted with puddles of gray water and old pond scum. Old logs, rotten and moss-smothered, tilted out of the earth at odd angles, like splinters in the finger of a titan. A few nondescript rocks broke the surface here and there, most too dark to be properly discerned. Flat patches of some sort of reddish, fuzzy fungus drifted lazily across the surface, and a thin haze of mist coiled and shifted throughout the pit. Taius began to relax, as mercifully, it seemed it would be easy enough to climb out. Tangles of old roots and other things protruded from the walls of the pit at every elevation. Most of them gathered over what appeared to be a hollow in the earthen wall, a shallow cave he had no interest in entering. If he could run, he could climb too. Pinching his nose to keep the rancid odor away, he took a step toward the nearest cluster of roots he could use to start climbing. His shin brushed against one of the drifting planes of mold, and it shifted in a very different way from what he was expecting. It felt heavy. Too heavy. His eyes were drawn to it, and he watched, mesmerized as it rolled over on itself. It was dark and furry. It almost looked like... And then there was the face of a dark-furred canine. Rotting, hollowed eye sockets empty, its facial structure held together only by the bones left inside its hollowed skin. Naturally, Taius screamed again, flailing back from the carcasses as his heart rate spiked. "These aren't fungus," he realized with a feeling of dread. "These are corpses!" And the ones who created them had finally had enough of his profound racket. Something moved in the hollow in the wall he had noticed earlier. Looking that way, his heart clenched like a vice as several small creatures emerged from the darkness. They were skinny beasts, around the size of a small dog, their lanky bodies twitching in quick motions that drew attention to their wrinkly gray skin. A snout akin to that of an anteater transitioned into a long black proboscis, tipped with two distinct points. Thick, bulbous sacs hung from the collarbones of the creatures, each one sloshing with some undefinable liquid, feeding into open tubes emerging from the backs of their heads. The mist that clogged the pit was seeping from those tubes, and it smelled of swamp rot. Beady black eyes on the front of their heads focused on Taius, and their proboscises rose. Miscuits. He knew of these things. He recalled that they were generally considered pests more than anything, scavenging cousins of rodents who liquefied the insides of dead creatures by injecting their corpses with a potent acid and then drinking them up. The sacs could store water and extra food, like a grotesque perversion of a squirrel's cheek pockets, and some of their bodily waste was expunged from the tubes on their back, creating a foul-smelling mist that served both to mark territory and to dissuade predators. Normally, they didn't bother hunting anything bigger than them. Normally. But these were skinny. They looked at Taius, and he saw hunger in their eyes. They would take their chances, and there were a lot more of them than him. Damn it, damn it, damn it! Taius wailed, throwing himself against the wall and desperately trying to clamber up. He heard the miscuits slurping and burbling behind him, their vocalizations like sucking ice cubes up through an old straw, and heard their tiny feet scrabbling across the tilted logs and rocks of the pit. One of their proboscises stabbed into the muddy wall right by his leg, eliciting a squeak from him. On reflex, he lifted his foot and drove it into the miscut's face, sending it tumbling back into the water below. Get away from me, you things! Taius shouted, his voice echoing through the swamp all around him. It occurred to him that it might not be wise to draw more attention to himself in so inhospitable an environment, but that notion was quickly subsumed by his panic as another of the things jumped for him. This one found him, its tiny claws bunching up the fabric on the back of his shirt. He gasped, his foot momentarily losing purchase on the wall. He felt the miscuit hunting for a spot of soft meat to plunge its proboscis into, the sharp tip poking and prodding along his shirt. He could feel the burn of the acid dripping from the tip, and he realized that the feral monster was salivating at the thought of drinking him like a bottle of cheap beer. Get off! He shrieked again, shaking himself like a wet dog. The beast did not relent, and it made a jab for his neck. It missed only because of his thrashing, and its proboscis embedded itself into the mud of the wall. Taius looked up to the ledge, to freedom. He was maybe halfway there. He wouldn't make it with this thing hounding him, but he didn't dare remove his hands from the wall. If he fell, he'd only find more of the monsters waiting for him. Desperate, and out of options, he redoubled his efforts to climb while lending his voice once more to the midnight air. "Help me!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. "They're going to eat me! Someone! Anyone help me!" The miscuit lunged again, and this time its proboscis found its mark, embedding itself into Taius's back just under his shoulder blade. He howled in pain, and he could feel the agonizing burn as the creature pumped acid into his system. A rush of adrenaline gave him the energy he needed to shake once more, throwing the damn thing off at last. He heard it slurping up his blood as it fell away from him, before it hit the water below with a splash. Gasping, Taius finally reached the edge. He could still feel the acid in his body, and the burn was spreading. He could only pray that it wasn't a sufficient dose to kill him, but if it kept spreading... Finally, he made it to the ledge. Spluttering, he hauled himself over and rolled onto his back, gazing distantly at the sky overhead. He could hear the miscuits skittering about beneath, their straw-like mouths sucking fruitlessly at the air. To his knowledge, they couldn't climb, and he needed a goddamned rest. So he did not move. He just lay there and caught his breath. The burning continued to spread, and it wasn't getting any better. Taius coughed, and he felt his heart shriveling when he tasted copper. Touching his lips, he pulled his hand away to find a thin coat of blood clinging to the tips of his fingers. "Oh. Great," he murmured, too tired now to muster up much more than that. His vision was starting to cloud over, and the pain was getting worse. And worse. And so much worse. He moaned. It was the low, quiet sound of a dying animal. Resigned, he rolled onto his side. His vision swam. His mouth went dry, and he found himself losing feeling in the tips of his fingers and toes. He was truly dying, wasn't he? The edges of his vision darkened, and the world abandoned him. The last thing he saw was a silhouetted figure emerging from the nearby shrubbery, silent as death itself. "Must be Anuna's Reaper," Taius thought, closing his eyes. "I'll wait for you, Glenn." There was a sharp pain in his head, and he stopped thinking.